Imagine losing everything, your dignity, your hope, and even your chance at a meal. But all Jack wanted and asked for was a plate of food in exchange for work. But instead of help, he was humiliated, expelled, and treated like nobody else. Years later, life takes an unbelievable turn. He becomes a millionaire. And when he decides to return to the restaurant where he was scorned, something shocking awaits him. For the past 5 years, Jack had been living on the streets of a large city in the United States. Before falling into homelessness, he had lived a normal life, with a steady job and a roof over his head. However, a series of tragic events, combined with the economic crisis, pushed him to the brink of despair. The loss of his job, mounting debts, and the lack of a support network led him to end up on the streets, battling the cold, hunger, and, above all, the indifference of society. Jack wasn't someone who loudly complained about his misfortune. He had learned to accept the harshness of life on the streets, but every new dawn still carried a small glimmer of hope that he stubbornly kept alive. His days were filled with endless walking, searching for a place to rest or something to eat. He begged for help on street corners, in front of supermarkets or restaurants, and sometimes someone would give him a coin or a sandwich. On other occasions, all he received were looks of disdain. That winter had been especially cruel. The cold wind that whipped against Jack's skin seemed to mock his vulnerability. Huddled in an old, dirty coat, he sought shelter wherever he could, but the truth was that hunger gnawed at him more than the cold. He hadn't had a decent meal in 2 days, surviving only on scraps he found in a cafe's trash bin. One day, utterly exhausted, Jack found himself in front of a downtown restaurant. He often passed by, watching the well-dressed people going in and out, talking cheerfully while enjoying their meals. From the sidewalk, Jack could smell the warm food coming from inside, which only intensified the emptiness in his stomach. Desperate but still trying to maintain his dignity, he mustered up the courage to ask for help directly. Timidly, Jack stepped inside the restaurant, feeling the gaze of the patrons immediately turn towards him. His tattered clothes and the look of someone who hadn't showered in days betrayed his condition. Trying to ignore the judgmental stares, Jack walked up to the counter where the owner of the restaurant, David, was busy organizing orders. David was a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a perfectly groomed appearance. To him, the success of the restaurant was the result of hard work and discipline, and he prided himself on the establishment's image. With a hoarse, hesitant voice, Jack approached David and said, "Excuse me, sir. I don't mean to bother you, but I'm very hungry. If you let me, I can wash dishes or do any work in exchange for a plate of food." David, without even lifting his head from his work, let out a disdainful sigh. He hated it when homeless people entered his restaurant, believing that their presence drove away the middle and upper-class customers who frequented the place. In a dry tone, he responded, "No, this is not a place for beggars. If you don't have money, there's nothing I can do for you." Surprised by the man's coldness, Jack tried to plead further. "I just need a meal, sir. I can work for it. All I'm asking for is something to eat." David finally looked up, his face now full of pure impatience and contempt. He scanned Jack from head to toe, as if he were looking at something repulsive, and then raised his voice for everyone in the restaurant to hear. "If you want food, go to a shelter. We serve people who can pay here. I don't have time for charity." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Humiliated, he felt his cheeks burn with shame and sorrow. The room seemed to shrink as he realized that everyone in the restaurant was looking at him with the same disdain as the owner. His heart, which until that moment had harbored a small spark of hope, was crushed. Without saying another word, Jack hung his head, turned slowly, and left the restaurant, feeling smaller than ever. The sound of laughter and the clinking of silverware inside seemed distant as he walked along the cold streets, aimlessly, fighting back the tears welling up in his eyes. It wasn't physical hunger that hurt the most at that moment, but the humiliation and contempt he had just faced. Though he was accustomed to hardship, being treated so inhumanely by someone who could have made a difference cut him deeply. Wandering aimlessly, Jack wondered when his life had taken such a cruel turn. How had he ended up here? Memories of better days still flickered in his mind, like a distant dream he could barely remember. But despite the blow, Jack was resilient. He knew he had to keep going. He stopped for a moment, sat on a park bench, and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He had to find a way to survive the day, as he had done so many times before. There was no other choice. He stood up from the bench, adjusted the old coat around his body, and resumed walking. Every step took him farther from the restaurant and the humiliation he had suffered there. But the memory of David's face, with its cold arrogance, would stay etched in his mind. Jack walked for hours, unsure of where he was going. People passed by in a hurry, immersed in their own lives, paying no attention to the man who had nothing left to expect from life. His feet ached, and his mind wandered between memories of the past and the harsh reality he was living. He was tired and hungry, but somehow he knew that there was still a thread of hope somewhere, even if he couldn't see it at that moment. And then something unexpected happened. As he walked, something caught his eye, glinting on the sidewalk. On the ground, amidst dry leaves and dirt, there was a small bill. Jack stopped, looked around, and bent down to pick it up. It was a $20 bill, crumpled but still a treasure for someone who had nothing. He held the money in his hands, incredulous. It seemed that fate, as cruel as it had been that day, was offering him a small chance. A faint smile appeared on his face. Perhaps, finally, things were starting to change. With the $20 bill in his hands, Jack felt a mix of relief and surprise. It was a small miracle for someone who, just minutes earlier, had absolutely nothing. Sitting on a park bench, he looked at the money as if it were a gift from the heavens, an unexpected present that could, at the very least, help him make it through another day. Hunger was still an urgent need. Jack's first thought was simple: buy something to eat. He didn't want to spend it all at once, so he decided to walk to a simple cafe downtown where he knew he could get an affordable meal. Upon entering, the aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread greeted him from the counter. It was a relief to know that this time, unlike his last experience at the restaurant, he had enough to pay. After buying a sandwich and a cup of coffee, Jack sat at one of the tables near the window. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax and enjoy the meal. The simple sandwich felt like a feast, and each bite was a small comfort to his tired and hungry body. The warm coffee soothed his empty stomach, and for a brief moment, Jack felt human again. It was in these small moments that he reminded himself that, even in the harshest of circumstances, small gestures or opportunities could change his day. As he finished his meal, Jack looked at the change he had received. There was about $10 left. He knew he needed to save this money to survive the next few days, but an idea began to form in his mind. The night before, he had had a strange but comforting dream. In the dream, he saw a series of numbers that felt important somehow, as if they were showing him a path. Jack wasn't the type to believe in superstitions or omens, but the dream had been so vivid that he couldn't get it out of his head. The numbers stayed with him, etched in his memory, and now, as he held the leftover money, he thought about the possibility of trying his luck. On the corner of a busy street, he knew there was a convenience store that sold lottery tickets. Without much conviction, he decided to follow his instinct. When he arrived at the store, the atmosphere was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the cold outside. The clerk behind the counter looked bored, but Jack, determined, approached and asked for a lottery ticket. He stared at the ticket in his hand for a few moments, feeling a mix of hope and disbelief. After all, what were the chances of actually winning something? But remembering the dream, he carefully filled in the numbers. On the ticket, he marked the exact numbers he had seen in the dream: 3, 12, 19, 27, 33, and 45. It was an absurd bet, and Jack knew it. The lottery rarely changed the lives of ordinary people, much less someone living on the streets. But at that moment, it wasn't so much the expectation of winning that motivated him. It was the need to believe that something good could still happen. With the ticket filled out and paid for, Jack left the store and resumed walking the streets, not really expecting much from the outcome. To him, it was just another attempt to escape the harsh reality for a few minutes, a temporary distraction. In the days that followed, Jack continued his life as usual, wandering the streets, begging for coins, and trying to survive. He barely thought about the lottery anymore. It seemed like something so distant and unrealistic that it became a vague memory, lost amid the daily struggle for food and shelter. The crumpled ticket remained in his coat pocket, along with other scraps of paper and small items he carried with him. It was only a week later that he remembered the bet. Walking by the convenience store where he had bought the ticket, Jack saw a sign announcing the winning numbers. He stopped for a moment, glancing at the news with no real expectation. But a voice inside urged him to check. Pulling the crumpled ticket from his pocket, he unfolded it carefully and looked at the numbers. With his heart beating a little faster, Jack compared the numbers on the sign to those he had marked on his ticket. And suddenly the impossible happened. All the numbers matched. He read them once, then again, rubbing his eyes as if he couldn't believe it. His heart raced, and his hands began to tremble. He checked one more time. There was no mistake. Jack had hit every single number. Jack was stunned. $100 million. That was the amount he had just won. From being a homeless man with no prospects, he had become a millionaire overnight. The emotions came in waves: shock, disbelief, fear, joy. Jack felt lost, as if he were in a dream, trapped between the nightmare of his current reality and the promise of an unimaginable future. The realization didn't hit him right away. He walked the streets, clutching the ticket as if it were a fragile treasure that could disappear at any moment. How could this be true? Just a week ago, he had been humiliated for asking for food, and now he was on the verge of having more money than he could ever imagine in a lifetime. What would he do with his fortune? How would his life change? These questions flooded his mind, but before making any decisions, he knew he had to take the next step, confirm the win, and claim his prize. His heart pounded so hard that he could feel the blood pulsing in his temples. Jack knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. As soon as he could process what was happening, Jack headed to the lottery headquarters in the city. There, the bureaucratic formalities began. The ticket was checked and validated. It was official. Jack was the winner of the $100 million prize. Signing the paperwork and receiving the confirmation, he felt a surreal sensation wash over him. For the first time in years, fate had given him a chance to start over. That night, Jack lay awake in a modest hotel room he had rented after confirming his win. He could hardly believe that, in just a few days, his life had completely transformed. The money hadn't yet been transferred to his account, but the mere knowledge that it was coming was enough to fill his mind with dreams and plans. He thought about how he would use the money, but at the same time, he knew he didn't want to become arrogant or insensitive. He had learned in his years on the streets the true value of humility and compassion. Jack closed his eyes, though sleep was slow to come. However, this time it wasn't hunger or fear keeping him awake. It was the anticipation of a new beginning. Something he had never thought possible, but now, against all odds, was within his reach. The morning Jack officially became a millionaire began with the same kind of sunshine he had seen on so many other days. But this time, the feeling that accompanied him was completely different. After years of living in poverty, Jack now knew that his future would be shaped by something unimaginable: $100 million. The money, which had already been deposited into his account, represented freedom and the possibility of starting over, but it also brought new responsibilities in an entirely different world. When Jack first received the money, a wave of emotions overwhelmed him. At first, it was pure disbelief, like everything was some kind of prank played by fate. For so long, he had struggled to survive, begging for spare change and sleeping in the cold, that the idea of having a fortune at his disposal seemed like a distant dream. He had gone so long without anything that sudden wealth was impossible to fully comprehend. His first days as a millionaire were spent in a simple hotel where he could finally sleep in a comfortable bed, take a hot shower, and enjoy decent meals without the constant worry of where his next bite would come from. However, Jack wasn't interested in extravagance. Even now, with a fortune in his hands, he didn't want to lose sight of who he was or where he had come from. Luxury didn't tempt him the way it might tempt others. He wanted to use the money wisely. With his humble mindset, Jack knew he couldn't just start spending without thinking. The first thing he did was seek advice. He found a financial advisor he could trust, recommended by a nonprofit organization that helped lottery winners manage their fortunes. The idea of handling millions of dollars was overwhelming for him, and Jack knew he needed help to avoid wasting the opportunity. When he met with the advisor, Jack was honest about his situation. He explained his story, how he had spent the last 5 years living on the streets, and how he had been treated with contempt and indifference by so many people. The advisor, surprised by Jack's humility and good sense, advised him to take things slowly and carefully. "You have the chance to change your life completely," the advisor said, "but wealth can be as much of a burden as poverty if you don't know how to use it." Jack followed the advice. The first thing he did was organize his finances securely. He invested part of the money to ensure a stable income for the rest of his life, enough to keep him comfortable without ever worrying about falling back into poverty. But even with this financial security, Jack remained discreet. He knew that money could change how people treated him, and he wanted to stay true to who he was. With his finances under control, Jack began to think about what he truly wanted to do with his newfound status. His first desire was simple but deeply meaningful to him: buy a house. After years without a home, sleeping in shelters and on the streets, Jack dreamed of having a place of his own. He chose a modest house, far from the city center, where he could find peace and quiet. For Jack, having a permanent roof over his head and a warm bed to sleep in was the true luxury. After securing his home, Jack decided to fulfill something he had always dreamed of: helping others. He remembered all the cold nights when he had found support from people who, even though they didn't know him, had reached out to help. It was in shelters and charitable organizations that he had managed to survive during his years on the streets, and he knew he wanted to give back in some way. With part of his fortune, Jack began donating to local charities, especially those that supported homeless individuals and vulnerable people. Helping those who were in the same position he had once been in was a personal mission for Jack. But despite all this transformation, Jack never forgot who he was and where he came from. Unlike so many others who might let fortune go to their heads, Jack maintained a deep connection to his past life. He didn't want to lose sight of the humility that the experience of poverty had taught him. Over the months, he also took care not to flaunt his wealth. He didn't buy flashy luxury cars or make major renovations to his house. He drove a comfortable but modest car, and his clothes remained simple. Jack knew that money was a tool, not a status symbol. However, despite all the comfort and financial security he now had, Jack still carried the emotional scars of his years on the streets. He remembered every look of disdain, every moment when he was ignored as if he were invisible. And of course, he never forgot that fateful day at the restaurant when he had been humiliated by David, the owner who had thrown him out with no regard. That painful memory was still vivid in his mind, and silently Jack had vowed to himself that he would never treat anyone the way he had been treated that day. 2 years had passed since Jack became a millionaire. His life had indeed changed drastically. He was respected, his donations made him a well-known figure among local charities, and he now had everything he needed to live with dignity. But despite his new reality, something within Jack urged him to revisit his past, to reconnect with his roots. There was a chapter in his life that he felt needed to be closed. Then, on an ordinary day, while driving through the city in his discreet car, Jack passed by the same restaurant where years earlier he had been humiliated. The place looked visibly different. The windows were dirty, and the closed doors indicated that the restaurant was no longer in operation. Something inside Jack made him stop the car and take a closer look. He stood there for a few minutes, silently staring at the restaurant, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. He knew that fate had been merciless to him for many years, but now he had the power to be more than just someone who survived. He had the chance to show that even after everything, he could still be a better person, someone who would choose forgiveness over revenge. Jack decided that he needed to go back to that restaurant and find David, the man who had once despised him. But Jack wasn't going there to humiliate David, as he had once been humiliated. He wanted something bigger, something that could change both of their lives forever. And with that decision, he knew he was finally ready to face the past and close that chapter. Moved by an impulse, Jack decided to get out of the car and walk toward the entrance of the restaurant. His clothes were simple, But the car he drove, while not extravagant, was enough to suggest he had found success. As he approached, Jack noticed that there was no longer any activity inside. The chairs were stacked, the floor was covered in dust, and the lights were off. The restaurant had clearly been closed for some time. As he neared the door, something unexpected caught his attention. Sitting on the sidewalk, head bowed, was a man. His clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his hunched shoulders conveyed a deep sense of defeat. Jack stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. The man, almost unrecognizable in his desperate state, was David, the same restaurant owner who had once treated him with such contempt. Now David sat there, seemingly broken, reflecting the vulnerability Jack had experienced for so long. The restaurant, once his pride, was now nothing more than the ruin of a failed dream. Without letting bitterness take over, Jack decided to approach him. He walked toward David and stopped in front of him, but the man didn't recognize him immediately. His eyes were swollen from crying, and he seemed lost in a world of regret and frustration. Jack, with a calm and compassionate voice, called out, "Excuse me, are you okay?" David slowly lifted his head, as if waking from a nightmare. His eyes, dull and tired, met Jack's, but there was no sign of recognition. He just sighed and shook his head. "No, nothing is okay," David muttered, his voice choked with pain. "I've lost everything. My restaurant is closed. I'm bankrupt. I don't know what to do anymore." Jack listened in silence, feeling the weight of David's words. It was strange for him to stand there facing the man who had once treated him with such disdain, but who now was on the verge of collapse. However, instead of feeling vindicated, Jack felt deep empathy. He knew exactly what it was like to lose everything, to feel invisible and defeated by the world. And even though David didn't recognize him, Jack saw this as an opportunity to help, not for revenge, but out of compassion. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jack said, keeping his identity a secret. "Sometimes life takes us to places we never imagined. But even in the hardest times, there's always a way to start over." David looked at Jack with a puzzled expression. The words from this stranger seemed to carry a weight, as if he truly understood what he was saying. But David didn't have the strength to argue or ask questions. He simply let out another heavy sigh. "I don't know what else to do," David responded, shaking his head. "I tried to keep the restaurant open, but the debts piled up. I lost customers, I lost everything. Now I don't even have a penny to start over." Jack remained calm and composed, determined not to let the opportunity slip away. There was something bigger at play here, and he knew that what he did in this moment could change David's life forever. "What if you had a second chance?" Jack asked, his words loaded with hidden meaning. David let out a bitter laugh, clearly not believing in such a possibility. "A second chance? I wouldn't even know what to do with it. I have no one left to help me, and with everything I've lost, I don't even know where to begin." Jack kept his friendly tone, continuing the conversation. "Sometimes help comes from where we least expect it, and what matters is how we choose to use that opportunity. We all make mistakes, but the important thing is to learn from them." David looked at Jack, confused by these words. Something about the way this stranger spoke resonated deeply within him, as if he was offering more than just comforting words. But before David could ask more, Jack gave a slight smile and bid him farewell. "Good luck, David. I hope you find the right path." Without waiting for a response, Jack stood up and walked back to his car. He knew that David hadn't yet understood what had happened, but soon life would reveal something greater to him. Jack had already decided that he would return the next day to complete what he had started. As he drove home, Jack thought about the encounter. The old Jack, the man who had been humiliated and hopeless, might have taken pleasure in David's misfortune. But the new Jack knew that true power didn't lie in revenge, but in forgiveness, in the opportunity to give someone a second chance. To him, this was the moment to show that money hadn't corrupted his soul and that forgiveness was the nobler path. Deep down, Jack knew that fate had given him a unique opportunity, not just to change his own life, but to transform the life of someone who had once caused him pain. And by choosing to help David, he was fulfilling his commitment to the humanity he carried within himself. The past was behind him, but the lesson of compassion and humility would stay with him forever. The morning after his encounter with David, Jack woke up with a sense of inner calm he hadn't felt in a long time. That brief meeting with the former restaurant owner had stirred in him a deep feeling of compassion, something far beyond the wounds left by the humiliation he had endured 2 years ago. Jack knew that, with his financial power and new outlook on life, he had the chance not only to change David's life, but also to teach him a valuable lesson about empathy and humility. As Jack had breakfast in his modest home, he reflected on how much his life had changed. He had chosen not to let the money corrupt him, despite the temptation to live in luxury and excess. For Jack, true wealth lay in acts of kindness, and especially in offering others a chance to start over, just as fate had offered him. And now this was his mission, to help David see the world differently. Determined to carry out his plan, Jack made a call to his financial advisor, explaining what he wanted to do. Although donating a significant sum to someone who had mistreated him in the past might seem unusual, Jack was fully convinced that this was the right path. His advisor, familiar with Jack's generosity and character, agreed to make the necessary arrangements for the donation to be made discreetly. Everything would be done anonymously, without any trace linking the generosity back to Jack. After finalizing the details, Jack got into his car and drove once again to the restaurant. Now, with the certainty of what he was about to do, he felt at peace. When he arrived at the location, he found the scene exactly as he had left it the day before. The restaurant was still closed, and the building clearly showed signs of neglect. However, this time, David was not sitting on the sidewalk. Jack decided to wait for a few minutes, hoping he would appear. As he waited, Jack couldn't help but reflect on how life comes full circle. He remembered all the times he had passed by that same restaurant, starving, wishing for a simple meal. Now the situation was entirely different, and the irony of life had placed him in a position of power, not to humiliate but to help. After a few minutes of waiting, he saw David approaching in the distance, walking with his head down, visibly worn out. David was more lost than ever. Since the restaurant had closed, he had been trying to find a way to deal with his debts and start over. But everything seemed impossible. He no longer had credit, his reputation was ruined, and the feeling of failure consumed him more and more each day. To him, life had reached a dead end, and the future seemed bleak. When he saw Jack standing near the restaurant, David hesitated, still not recognizing him. Jack in turn nodded and approached him once again. "Good morning," Jack said with a gentle smile. David, still perplexed by the stranger's kindness, responded, "Good morning. I wasn't expecting to see you here again. I passed by and thought I'd stop to talk again." "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me yesterday," Jack began, still keeping his identity hidden. "I know things seem difficult now, but I want you to know that not everything is lost." David sighed deeply, still carrying the weight of defeat on his shoulders. "I appreciate your words, but I don't know what else to do. I've lost everything. My restaurant, my home. I have nowhere to go." Jack, remaining calm and friendly, continued, "Sometimes things need to hit rock bottom before we can rebuild. I'm not here to judge you, but to offer you something that might help." David frowned in confusion. He didn't expect help from anyone, especially not from a stranger who seemed to be in a much better position than he was. Before he could respond, Jack smiled slightly and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Yar, there are things we can't control, like life circumstances. But there is one thing you can change from now on: how you treat others, especially those who are struggling." David lowered his eyes, ashamed. He knew that for many years he had treated vulnerable people with indifference, ignoring their needs and acting selfishly. His arrogance and pride had blinded him to the hardships of others, and now he was paying the price for that. Before David could say anything else, Jack said, "I know this may seem unexpected, but someone left this for you." Jack pulled an envelope from inside his jacket and handed it to David. The man, surprised, took the envelope with trembling hands. "What is this?" David asked, still confused. "An opportunity. Open it and you'll see, Jack responded, maintaining his secrecy. David carefully opened the envelope and found two documents inside. The first was a certificate stating that all the debts related to the restaurant had been paid off by an anonymous donor. He would no longer have to worry about creditors or the mortgages that had been weighing him down. The immediate relief was overwhelming. His eyes widened, and he brought a hand to his mouth, incredulous. The second document was even more surprising. It was a notice of a $1 million donation, intended for him to restart his life and his business. David could hardly process what he was reading. He flipped the paper over several times, as if expecting to find some mistake or cruel joke, but everything was clear. The money was his, and all his debts had been erased. This can't be real, David stammered, looking at Jack with tear-filled eyes. Jack smiled gently and responded, "It's real. Someone believes you deserve a second chance. But there's one condition. Just one." David, still in shock, trying to comprehend what was happening, asked, "Anything. Whatever it is." Jack stepped closer and with a serious tone said, "The only condition is that the next time a homeless person or someone hungry comes to you asking for help, you don't turn them away. Don't treat them with disdain. Remember that we can all find ourselves in difficult situations someday." David felt the weight of those words. They echoed deeply inside him, as if they were the reflection of all the mistakes he had made in the past. He knew that this lesson was not just fair, it was necessary. Still unaware of Jack's true identity, he nodded eagerly. "I promise. I'll never treat anyone like that again. Never." Jack smiled reassuringly and stepped back. "Good. That's all you need to do." David, still overwhelmed, didn't know how to express his gratitude. He tried to find the right words, but all he could manage was a whispered, "Thank you," his voice choked with emotion. Jack nodded, said goodbye, and walked away, leaving David alone with his thoughts. The freedom from his debts, and the generous donation that would allow him to start over. David stood there, looking at the envelope and the documents in his hands, still unaware that the man who had forever changed his life was the same one he had once cruelly turned away. Jack had chosen not to reveal his identity at that moment, knowing that the true value of his act lay in the lesson David had learned and the opportunity for redemption he now had. Jack returned to his car, feeling at peace. He knew he had done the right thing. The money hadn't corrupted his heart, and forgiveness, rather than vengeance, had brought him the satisfaction he had long sought. The cycle was complete, and now both he and David could move forward. The days following his encounter with Jack were filled with a mix of relief and disbelief for David. He still couldn't fathom the generosity he had received. The idea that a complete stranger had paid off all his debts and donated $1 million to help him start over was simply incredible. David repeatedly wondered who this mysterious benefactor could be, but no matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't come up with an answer. For now, what mattered most was that he had a second chance. With the money he had received, David began planning how to rebuild his life. The first step was to renovate the restaurant, which had become a shadow of its former self. He invested part of the funds in fixing up the place, hiring a small team to help him restore its former glory. But something inside David had changed profoundly. The arrogance and pride that had once driven him were no longer part of his personality. He now understood that his failure wasn't just due to bad luck, but also because of his inability to treat people with empathy. With a humble heart, David decided that this time he would do things differently. He began making small changes to the restaurant, from the menu to the way he treated his customers and staff. But more than that, he committed to never again turning away anyone in need, especially those living on the streets. He remembered the promise he had made to the mysterious man and decided to honor it with all his heart. A few weeks later, the restaurant reopened. There were no grand announcements or parties, just a quiet reopening, with David determined to restart with a new spirit. In the first few days, only a few customers showed up, but as time went on, people started to return. The food was as good as ever, but now the owner had a completely different approach. He smiled at everyone, treated his employees with respect, and, most importantly, helped anyone who came to his door in need of a meal. It was on one of these afternoons, While David was working behind the counter, that a man in tattered clothes entered the restaurant. He hesitated at the entrance, as if afraid he would be turned away, just as had happened so many times before. David saw the scene from a distance and, instead of ignoring or chasing the man away, as he would have in the past, he walked over to him with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon," David said. "How can I help you?" The man, clearly surprised by the kindness, stammered, I, I don't have any money, but I'm really hungry. If you give me something to eat, I can wash the dishes or do any kind of work you need." That scene sparked something deep inside David. He immediately remembered the moment, 2 years ago, when he had humiliated a man who had said almost the exact same words. The face of that man, the one he had coldly rejected, came back to his mind with full force. And at that moment, the truth hit David like a lightning bolt. The man who had helped him was the very same one he had once humiliated. David stood frozen for a few seconds, his heart racing, his mind reeling with the realization. He now clearly remembered that day, the man who had come in starving, asking for nothing but a chance, and how he had treated him with such cruelty. And suddenly everything made sense. The man who had returned to speak with him, the anonymous donation, the promise to never turn away someone in need. It was him, Jack. With his breath quickening, David felt a flood of shame and gratitude overwhelm him. He had been saved by the very person he had wronged. That realization was crushing, but at the same time, it was eye-opening. David looked at the hungry man before him and with a genuine smile nodded. "You don't need to do anything in return. Today, the meal is on me." The man, incredulous, thanked him with tear-filled eyes and sat at one of the tables. David went into the kitchen and personally prepared the meal, knowing the significance of this gesture. He wasn't just fulfilling the promise he had made to Jack. He was redeeming himself from his past, one meal at a time. Watching the man devour his food, David felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew that he could never undo the mistakes of the past, but he could move forward differently from here on out. And more than that, he could pass on the lesson he had learned. Everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. A few days later, unable to contain his curiosity and his need to express his gratitude, David set out to find Jack. He visited shelters, asking about a man who had once been homeless, but had since become wealthy. It was a difficult search, but after several attempts, he finally discovered where Jack lived. He found out that Jack had bought a modest house on the outskirts of the city, far from the attention that his fortune could have drawn. David decided to visit him. When he arrived at Jack's house, he was greeted with a gentle smile. Jack didn't seem surprised, as if he had known that this moment would eventually come. They sat down in a small garden, and with tears in his eyes, David began to speak. "I know who you are now, and I understand what you did for me. I don't know how to thank you. I didn't deserve it." Jack, with a serene smile, responded, "I didn't do it to make you feel like you owe me anything. I did it because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to lose everything and to have no one to help you. Sometimes life gives us a second chance, and it's up to us to make something good out of it." David felt tears rolling down his face. His heart was filled with both regret and gratitude, and he could barely find the words. "You saved me," he said, his voice breaking. "And you gave me more than just money. You taught me a life lesson that I will never forget." Jack nodded, understanding the significance of the moment. There was no need for more words. Both men knew that the cycle was complete. The past had been forgiven, and now the present offered them both a new path forward. In the days that followed, David continued to thrive, not just as a businessman, but as a person. He fulfilled his promise every day, offering food to anyone who came to his door, never judging or rejecting them. The restaurant prospered once again, but now with a spirit of generosity and empathy guiding every decision he made. As for Jack, he continued to live simply, always discreet and reserved. The money had not corrupted him, and he remained true to the principles he had learned during his difficult years on the streets. He knew that true wealth wasn't in how many millions he had in the bank, but in how he chose to use that fortune to positively impact the lives of others. And so both men moved forward, transformed by their experiences. David, now redeemed, and Jack, with a heart full of peace, had proven that, in the end, the true victory in life isn't in accumulating wealth, but in acting with compassion, humility, and forgiveness. Did you like this story of overcoming and turning around? So don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next exciting stories. How about sharing this video with someone who needs a dose of inspiration today? Oh, and don't stop here. Check out other videos on the channel that are full of drama, suspense, and life lessons. Stay with us and see you in the next chapter.